It was supposed to be an ordinary trial, routine, procedural, predictable. But when a teenage boy in a navy blue suit stood up from the courtroom bench and pointed at the witness stand, what he shouted stopped the entire room cold. "I know her," he declared, his voice cracking through silence like a lightning bolt. Cameras turned. The judge raised his gavel, and within minutes, the entire direction of the trial and one woman's fate was changed forever. This is a story of justice disrupted, truth resurrected, and how one brave voice revealed the power of memory and mercy. Location: Superior Court of Rome. Time: 3:41 p.m., Wednesday. 3 words: one boy. A courtroom frozen in time. The courtroom was formal, almost intimidating. Wood-paneled walls, polished floors, and a stern-looking judge who had seen it all. Rows of lawyers in sharp suits, and an audience tense with anticipation. Every chair was filled, every breath measured. The trial had reached a crucial moment. The witness, a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and trembling hands, stood at the front. Her story had been questioned, her motives dissected. She clutched the edge of the witness box like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her voice cracked as she spoke. The room watched, but didn't lean in. Then, from the third row, it happened. A sudden rustle, a chair scraped back. A teenager, black, no older than 17, stood tall. His voice rang out with no warning. "I know her!" It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration that cut through the static of formality and sent a jolt through the room. Heads turned. Papers froze mid-turn. Phones tilted discreetly to record. The court clerk looked up sharply. The judge raised the gavel halfway, unsure whether to call order or bear witness. The teenager took a step forward, and in that moment, the courtroom shifted. It wasn't about the docket. It wasn't about strategy. It was about truth, raw, inconvenient, and uninvited. It had stood up, and the world had no choice but to sit down and listen. Have you ever watched truth kick down the doors of procedure? Jeremiah Thomas, age 16, grew up in one of the most underserved neighborhoods on the edge of Rome. The buildings were cracked and tired, the streets littered with neglect, but he knew every corner like the back of his hand. Raised by his grandmother, Miss Evelyn, after his mother was incarcerated and his father disappeared, Jeremiah's childhood was a series of hard lessons and harder mornings. Miss Evelyn did her best. She stretched every euro, prayed over every meal, and told Jeremiah stories of men who found light even in the darkest alleys. Their apartment sat on the top floor of a crumbling complex. The heat barely worked in the winter. The elevator hadn't worked in years. On good days, the fridge held leftovers. On bad days, they shared boiled water and hope. Jeremiah walked 2 miles to school every morning before sunrise. Shoes too small, backpack too worn, but always upright. In the afternoons, he swept floors and fixed bicycles at a local repair shop. The owner paid him in coins and sandwiches. Jeremiah saved every cent he could, mostly to help Miss Evelyn with groceries. But he was different. He didn't complain. He didn't flinch. Jeremiah loved to read, not fiction or fantasy, but court cases, case studies, legal documents, cross-examinations. He found them at the public library and read them cover to cover like stories that held power. He had an incredible memory. One librarian joked that he could memorize a deposition faster than a song lyric. And he asked questions. Constantly. What happens when truth is buried? Who decides what evidence matters? What if the system is wrong? At school, he kept to himself. Not because he didn't want friends, but because he didn't have the time for masks. He faced racism from classmates, got searched twice by police in the same week for looking out of place in a wealthy district. But he never snapped. He never folded. "I don't want pity," he told his English teacher one afternoon. "I want purpose." She never forgot those words. He wrote essays that read like appeals. He debated without shouting. He knew how to build arguments without breaking people. He was 16, and somehow he already sounded like the man he would become. Have you ever seen someone grow into strength inside the cracks of the world? A year before the trial that would change everything, Jeremiah Thomas found himself in a situation that felt like a nightmare. It started with a student protest. Dozens of teens marched peacefully outside a municipal building, holding signs, chanting, demanding better funding for local schools. Jeremiah had gone to observe. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He just watched. The next day, graffiti was found on the city building's walls. A few windows had been broken overnight. A blurry surveillance still showed a figure in a hoodie, dark-skinned, young, and tall. That was all it took. Jeremiah was pulled from class 2 days later. No warning, no courtesy. He was taken to the local police station and questioned for hours without a guardian or lawyer present. They said someone had described a kid like him. When he asked who, they deflected. When he insisted on a phone call, they delayed. He was told it would go easier if he just admitted it. But Jeremiah hadn't done anything. He hadn't even stayed long at the protest. He left early to get to his shift at the repair shop. It didn't matter. Not then. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers. At school, teachers looked at him differently. Security guards followed him with sharper eyes. Some classmates stopped speaking to him entirely. The system had stamped him. But then came Ms. De Silva. She wasn't family. She wasn't even someone he knew well. She was a community outreach worker who happened to be volunteering at the library that afternoon. She remembered seeing him there right after the protest, looking up city zoning laws and reading about juvenile detention reform. She came forward, presented the library timestamp, pulled the security footage from the library camera, testified on his behalf. Because of her, the case didn't move forward. The charges were dropped, but the stain remained. When people see an accusation, they remember it longer than an acquittal. But Jeremiah didn't see her as a hero. He didn't call her his savior. He just said quietly, "She believed me when it was easier not to." That moment changed something in him. He started attending more hearings, sitting quietly in the back of courtrooms, listening, studying. He once told a school counselor, justice doesn't just happen. Someone has to demand it. He had seen the inside of injustice. He had felt what it was like to be punished not for what he did, but for how he looked. And now, a year later, the same woman who once defended him was on trial herself. He hadn't planned to be there, but when he heard her voice break on the stand, when he saw the courtroom lean away from her story, he couldn't stay seated. He stood, and everything changed. Have you ever known what it's like to be punished for fitting a profile, not a crime? The courtroom had returned to its usual rhythm. The attorneys whispered to their aides. The judge jotted notes beneath the bench light. Ms. De Silva, now seated at the witness stand, gripped the arms of the chair as if it were the only solid thing left in the room. Her testimony had been calm, but the questioning was anything but. Then Jeremiah stood. He hadn't planned to speak. He hadn't even told his grandmother he was coming. But something inside him snapped the moment Ms. De Silva's voice cracked under the prosecutor's tone. "She didn't hurt anyone," he shouted. Heads turned, gasps. The judge looked up sharply. "She saved me, saved a lot of us." The words rang out louder than the prosecutor's objections. "Order in the court," the judge said, pounding his gavel once. "Young man, you are not listed as a witness. Sit down, or you will be escorted out." Jeremiah took a deep breath. "You asked who she is," he said, locking eyes with the prosecutor. "I'll tell you. My name is Jeremiah Thomas, and I've got proof." The murmurs grew louder. One of the defense attorneys rose, sensing something different was taking hold of the room. "Let him speak," she said softly. The prosecutor bristled. "Your Honor, this is a disruption." The judge held up a hand. The room quieted again. "You have information relevant to this case?" Jeremiah nodded. "Then step forward," the judge said. And just like that, everything shifted. Jeremiah approached the bench, his hands steady, despite the storm inside. He carried no papers, no folder, just the truth. "I was once accused of a crime I didn't commit. No one believed me, not the school, not the police, not the system." He turned slightly, gesturing to Ms. De Silva. "Accept her. She found the footage. She vouched for me, and she didn't even know me." Ms. De Silva's eyes welled. "I'm here because someone like her exists, and you want to say she's guilty for helping someone else?" The silence was thick. Jeremiah pulled his phone from his pocket. "This is a message from 3 other kids she helped. I recorded it yesterday." He played it. A short video clip. 3 voices clear as bells. "She helped me get clean. She found my sister when the police gave up. She told me I was worth more than my worst mistake." The judge leaned back. The courtroom was still. The prosecutor said nothing. He couldn't, because what had just happened wasn't theatrics. It wasn't a planned defense. It was truth breaking through. Have you ever seen a courtroom reverse its tide with the cry of one witness? The courtroom held its breath. The prosecutor stood tall, eyes narrowed, voice sharp. "Are you on the witness list, Mr. Thomas?" Jeremiah didn't flinch. "No, sir, but I should have been." The prosecutor opened his mouth again, but before he could speak, Jeremiah turned to the bailiff. "May I give this to the court?" He handed over a worn folder, edges bent, corners frayed, but thick with contents. The judge motioned for the folder to be brought forward. The bailiff laid it gently on the bench. Inside were letters, handwritten in ink and pencil. Some from former students, some from parents, some from guidance counselors, all telling the same story. Ms. De Silva had helped them, guided them, believed in them. Photos fell between the pages, classroom snapshots, after-school cleanup efforts, food drives, shelter visits, notes of gratitude, certificates of service, glowing reviews from teachers who had seen lives turned around under her mentorship. The judge sifted through the documents in silence. The courtroom watched, unmoving. "What is this?" the prosecutor asked, trying to sound dismissive. "Evidence," Jeremiah replied. "You wanted to know who she really is. This tells you." He stepped back. His voice never rose. He didn't yell. He didn't grandstand. He just stood there, young, steady, and unshaken. A reporter in the back of the room typed quietly, fingers trembling over the keys. A defense attorney leaned in to whisper to her colleague, "That boy just changed this case." Across town, in a private Vatican chamber where the trial was being observed as part of a global judicial compassion initiative, Pope Francis sat watching the live stream. His aide leaned over, offering a briefing, but the Pope raised his hand, eyes still on the screen. He watched Jeremiah speak, watched him hand over the folder, watched the impact land. Then, softly, he whispered to the aide beside him, "He speaks like one anointed by truth." Back in the courtroom, the judge closed the folder and looked up. "We will recess briefly while this new material is reviewed," he said, his voice heavier now, touched by something deeper than legal protocol. Jeremiah returned to his seat. The room remained still, not because of fear, not because of authority, because something sacred had just filled the silence. It wasn't planned, it wasn't orchestrated. It was defiance, not loud, not wild, but sacred, the kind that rises not from rebellion, but from righteousness. Have you ever seen silence replaced by sacred defiance? The judge had called for a recess. The courtroom emptied in a hush, not in chaos, not in murmurs, just stunned silence. Journalists filed out quietly. The gallery exited slowly. It wasn't confusion that filled the air, it was reflection. The court clerk reviewed the folder Jeremiah had submitted. The defense attorney sifted through each letter. The judge read every single page. When the courtroom reconvened, it felt like returning to something new, as if the room had changed while they were gone. Jeremiah was called forward again. This time, he stood at the witness stand, sworn in, a Bible under one hand, the other raised high. He didn't flinch. He didn't stumble. His voice, while quiet, was unmistakably sure. He answered each question clearly, recounted how Ms. De Silva had helped him find legal representation during his false accusation, shared the exact date she tracked down the security footage, named the librarian who vouched for him, described how she followed up for weeks when no one else did. The courtroom, for the first time that day, leaned in. She didn't fail the system, he said. She fought it. Every day, for kids like me. He listed 3 others who had been impacted by her work. Quoted a counselor who once called her the most underpaid hero in the building. The judge's eyes never left him. The prosecution cross-examined, but their tone had changed. No more barking, no more rapid-fire dissection. They knew something sacred had entered the room, and they tiptoed around it. Jeremiah answered every question without faltering. He provided receipts, text messages, time-stamped photos, all from the folder he brought. "This isn't about whether you like her methods," he said. "It's about whether her impact is real." He paused, looked around the room, then down at Ms. De Silva. "She saw me," he said, "when everyone else saw a file number." Then he turned back to the jury. "I'm not just a witness," he said. He placed his hand over his heart. "I'm her legacy." A pause. A silence deeper than order, deeper than fear, the kind of silence that follows undeniable truth. The jurors sat straighter. Even the prosecutor leaned back. And Ms. De Silva, from her seat, lowered her head, not in shame, but in quiet awe. Because for the first time in a long time, someone else had done the fighting. Someone she once stood for was now standing for her. Have you ever seen identity itself become undeniable proof? The courtroom had grown quiet again, but this time it wasn't tension. It was reverence. After the final arguments were made and the judge gave his instructions, the jury filed out. The room held its breath. Jeremiah sat beside Ms. De Silva now. He didn't speak. He didn't fidget. He simply waited, hands folded, eyes steady on the door through which 12 strangers would decide her fate. Minutes passed, then more. Less than 2 hours later, the jury returned. Their faces said everything before their words did. Calm, certain, clear. The foreperson stood, paper in hand, voice firm. "On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant not guilty." Gasps broke, then relief, then the unmistakable sound of quiet sobbing. Miss De Silva covered her mouth, eyes wide, tears pouring freely. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The courtroom erupted into applause, not wild celebration, just a collective release. The clapping grew, and then someone stood, then another, then another, until the gallery rose in unison, not for a verdict, but for the story behind it. The judge waited for silence. He removed his glasses, glanced down at his desk, then back at Jeremiah. "Mr. Thomas," he said, his voice rich with emotion, "today you reminded this courtroom what justice sounds like." Jeremiah said nothing in return. He simply nodded. Then he turned to Ms. De Silva, who was now standing beside him. She reached for him, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. She cried into his shoulder. He didn't flinch. The gavel came down. But it didn't sound like an end. It rang like a beginning. It rang like a bell of freedom. And in that sound redemption echoed. It wasn't the court that had set her free. It was the truth, carried by a boy who had once needed saving himself. Have you ever seen redemption handed down by a teenager? The courtroom footage didn't just circulate. It erupted. Within hours, news outlets across continents shared the clip of Jeremiah standing, declaring, "I know her," with clarity and courage. From Rome to Johannesburg, from New York to Manila, the moment hit something universal. "I know her" began trending within 12 hours. But it wasn't just about Ms. De Silva anymore. People around the world began posting photos, memories, and letters. Stories of teachers, janitors, librarians, bus drivers, counselors, and neighbors. People who had changed their lives quietly. People who never made headlines until now. "My mentor bought me lunch every day my senior year," one tweet read. "She told me I mattered before I believed it myself." I know her. He helped me pass math when I was ready to give up. He never asked for credit. I know her. Thousands of messages flooded timelines, turning a courtroom disruption into a global reckoning with how society defines value. Talk shows covered it. College classes discussed it. Justice reform organizations used Jeremiah's testimony as a case study in youth advocacy and judicial responsiveness. The footage of the judge saying, "You reminded us what justice sounds like," was spliced into videos with background music, turned into TikToks, quoted in school assemblies. Then the Vatican released a brief statement. Truth needs no title. Sometimes it wears a school uniform. Signed, Pope Francis. That quote appeared on banners, T-shirts, posters. In schools across Italy and beyond, students wore ribbons that week with Ms. De Silva's name on them. She had gone from almost forgotten to globally honored. But more than that, the conversation had shifted. People began asking harder questions. Who are the quiet heroes in our communities? Why do we wait for them to be accused or attacked before we recognize their impact? Local governments launched grants for community mentors. Nonprofits raised funds for after-school programs led by unsung advocates. Jeremiah was invited to speak at youth summits and legal conferences, but he never made the story about him. "This isn't about my voice," he said during one live stream. "It's about making space for all the voices that never got a microphone." And in that moment, the world didn't just applaud. It listened. Have you ever watched a personal truth become a public movement? Today, the impact of that courtroom moment continues to ripple. Jeremiah Thomas, now 17, travels to youth justice forums across Europe. He shares his story, not as a hero, but as a reminder. He tells students, lawmakers, and advocates that courage doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from refusing to stay silent when silence feels safest. He volunteers with local public defenders, helping review juvenile cases and working with wrongly accused youth. He says it's his way of paying forward the belief someone gave me. His voice remains measured, grounded, but the room always goes quiet when he speaks. Ms. De Silva returned to the classroom briefly, but soon took on a new mission. She now serves as a national advocate for foster youth, helping to build bridges between social workers, schools, and legal systems. What happened in that courtroom, she says, isn't about me. It's about every adult who's ever tried to fight for a child and felt like they were losing. She tours the country, giving talks, mentoring new educators, and fighting for policy, changes that support children in vulnerable systems. But she always keeps a copy of Jeremiah's testimony in her binder, a reminder, she says, of what real advocacy looks like when it finds its echo. In the courtroom, where it all began, something new now exists. On the far right side of the gallery, near the bench, one seat has been marked with a bronze plaque. It reads, "Reserved for the voice that rises." It isn't for officials. It isn't for lawyers. It's there for anyone who dares to speak truth, even when protocol says sit down. Judges reference the case now in their training. Prosecutors are taught to listen more carefully. And law students write about Jeremiah not in chapters about disruption, but in those about integrity. And across the world, that phrase still echoes. I know her. I know him. I know what it means to be seen, and to see someone else in time. If you believe truth doesn't need permission to speak, share this story. Someone, somewhere, is still waiting to be heard.